How was the left wrong during COVID and why? What did they get wrong and why?
Well, I mean, the left was wrong in supporting these lockdowns and supporting censorship and supporting vaccine mandates. There was like no consideration, no discussion publicly about what's going to happen if we close schools for a very long time. And we now know that it really damaged learning outcomes. It has done irreparable damage to many kids. Make tens of thousands of mostly poor kids in a lot of cities just drop out of school, right? People were into the idea of forcing control for control's sake, forcing people to obey, forcing people to submit. It was disgusting. I came out of the lockdown. I came out of this pandemic just realizing what a classical liberal I am. And I consider myself a classical Marxist and a classical liberal. I take that stuff very seriously, like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, bodily autonomy. I'm not down with sacrificing that.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Christian Parenti, son of the legendary Michael Parenti, and a very good scholar in his own right, author of the book Radical Hamilton. And more recently, you've written a series of articles for Compact Magazine that have been quite controversial, to say the least. We're going to talk about some of them today. The main ones I want to get into are your article titled The Leftist Case for Kash Patel, Trump's appointee for head of the FBI. And probably even more controversial articles are your ones on COVID, which we're going to discuss in the back room, and your other one called The Cargo Cult of Woke. These all seem very separate, but they're kind of connected. And yeah, you've become a bit of a pariah, man, on the left, but you've been also telling them a lot of things that I think, frankly, they need to hear, which is why I'm having you on the show. But first and foremost, I think before we get into those articles specifically, I want to get you to address the kind of elephant in the room, which is Compact Magazine. I've had like 3 authors now who've written for Compact, and a comment I often get is, aren't they funded by right-wingers? Isn't it a post-left journal? Are they paying people on the left to spread right-wing anti-left propaganda?
Thank you very much for having me on the show, Tony. I appreciate it. I don't know where their funding comes from. I mean, it comes from subscriptions. Their subscription is almost $100 to Compact, like $90. So, get a couple thousand of those and you've got some money rolling in. They probably have funders, but I don't know. They don't tell me. I haven't actually asked. But so it's not like they pay a lot of money either, So yeah, I mean, Compact is started by these 2 Catholic integralist conservatives, these guys who were like right on social questions, left on economic questions, and a Marxist. And then the Marxist went off to law school, and then one of the founders, Sohrab Mari, recently went to Unheard. So, I mean, Compact is what it is. It's like, I don't know. You tell me. Like, it has right-wingers, left-wingers, liberals. I mean, Lori Wallach of TradeWatch just wrote something for it. So, whatever. The left freaks out. I mean, the left, I think that concern about compact, the way you describe it, I'm unaware of a lot of this stuff because I'm not really online that much. But I mean, I think this is all symptomatic of a real deep crisis in the left, which is manifesting itself increasing as a kind of like denial and panic and resort to metaphors of contagion and purity and that sort of stuff. So that's my take on that. But I think Compact is, um, generally well written, very often interesting.
My
And
impression
I find much of the left press is pretty stale. It's like I just reeks of a kind of fear and intellectual timidity and an instrumentalization of thought. That it's like the concern is like, what are the implications of, what's the implication of this argument, as opposed to what do the facts say and where do they lead, and you know what do I do with this set of facts, even if they present difficulties for my politics or my previous arguments. Maybe I have to change some of the claims I've been making. But the left seems really, really panicked about that. It's like, yeah, it really is like, you get the impression that many on the left are actually really afraid of being red pilled, like that they don't have the confidence of their own politics. It's like, no, it's like it's crack. Like if you do that once, you'll get addicted. Like you can't go there and taste that stuff, because then it'll like you'll be carried away by it. Like that's sort of
Mhm.
sad. So that'll be my take on that. Yeah.
Yeah, for real. Like, I mean, it does show a lack of confidence in one's positions. And if you want your positions to be supported by the general public, how do you expect that to happen if you don't even trust your own side to like engage with arguments of the other side
Right.
without getting quote unquote converted, whatever
Right.
that means? But
Yeah. And
I
if
heard,
yeah, go on. Sorry.
yeah, I heard Slavoj Žižek say that the reason why he published for Compact was just because like a lot of the mainstream progressive left press didn't want to publish what he was saying. And my impression of Compact is just that it kind of publishes people who are somewhat controversial. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to me like there's any cohesive like political leaning to it. Like I've seen all kind of types, and you're a person who comes from the left, very strong
Yeah.
socialist roots. It'd be funny to doubt
Well,
your credentials
yeah.
out of anybody.
I think they have some, they're maybe not totally open. They have, they're like solidly social democratic. They'd like to see an expanded welfare state and industrial policy and redistribution of wealth. But, the managing editor, Jeff Schillenberg, comes out of the left. I think he would identify as a leftist. But Matthew Schmitz, who's one of the founders, he's very Catholic. And so, his concern with matters of faith is, that would be pretty difficult for many on the left. Maybe not the Catholic left, if there's much of that left these days. But yeah, because it's not like a libertarian, like, yeah, anything goes. It's like, that's, it's not quite that, but it is pretty eclectic. And yeah, so that's what it is as far as I can tell. And it is true. I agree with Slavoj Žižek. There's things that the left press just won't let you publish on. So for example, COVID, that's, things that I wrote, that long article that we'll talk about later, the one left place that would do that was the gray zone. Max Blumenthal's like, balls of steel, not afraid of anything. And so he published, actually, first what he published was an article by my wife, Marcy Smith Parenti, in 2021 about menstruation disruption in the vaccine. And, he knew there was going to be tremendous blowback from that, but he did it anyway. And speaking of blowback, my understanding is this might be throttled down if we have this conversation right now. We still live, I don't know, maybe it's partly because you're Canadian, this is broadcast in Canada, but I don't know what the deal is, but I get the impression that people who publish on YouTube are still very worried about getting censored on this topic. So I shouldn't say too much more, I suppose. Yeah.
Mhm.
So that's what I say to that. And One level in terms of the left, I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm kind of less interested in the freakouts on the left. There's so much happening in the world. It's so weird that, you know, I'm kind of just focused on the facts as they evolve and stuff like that.
It's a good thing you're not on Twitter. It's the absolute worst when it comes to all of that.
Well, haven't they all decamped to blue sky?
I hope
Mhm.
that was gonna happen. I really
Yeah.
hoped, 'cause, like, I found the idea stupid. People were asking where that was gonna get blue sky. I'm like, why would I wanna be in a even bigger echo chamber? But I thought maybe it's a good thing because then the most annoying leftists will all go there. And I'm
Yeah.
still waiting for that to happen because 'cause that'll make life a hell of a lot easier. But
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Go on.
yeah, well, I was just gonna get into the first topic, right? Because, you know, there's a lot happening with there's a lot changing, it's kind of like as Gramsci said that the old world is dying and the new one is yet to be born, and I think there's a lot of uncertainties, and Trump is one such uncertainty, and his what he's doing with the deep state is a kinda something that is interesting, and, you have your article, "The Leftist Case for Kash Patel."
And a couple others on Compact about,
Uh-huh.
standing up to the deep state. Will the left confront the deep state? Yeah.
Right, and yeah, you've critiqued the left for not acknowledging the deep state's existence whatsoever, and but I think the more interesting thing to get into right away, because I've covered the deep state in this channel before. People who have been listeners know it's
Good for you.
if you don't think it's a real thing, I mean, come on, like, you just haven't been paying attention. But
Yeah.
why so, like, I think it's fair to say no one knows what's gonna happen with the Trump admin, but why should his appointee, Kash Patel, head of FBI, be something that leftists might look at with some critical support?
Because the FBI has been a bully against the left. It has been a destructive force that the American left has had to contend with for a very long time. Its precursor, the Bureau of Investigation, I think it might have been founded as early as 1908, and then it's in the late 20s under Hoover that it becomes the FBI. So it's like 100 years, and the left has been its primary target. And COINTELPRO did much to smash the new left and distort the new left. Right, the document, the official sort of order or directive from Hoover that goes out to all the field offices about disrupting and also misdirecting, right, the left. That's like a key thing. And so it's been destroying and misdirecting the left for a long time. And I wrote another piece for Unheard recently about the FBI, and in which I mentioned my father's own experience just briefly with the FBI. He was hounded by the FBI and he was blacklisted out of academia, and they came to our home and bothered my mother and, bothered him. And so I don't feel any sympathy for the FBI. I think the FBI is a rogue agency. It's out of control and it needs to be, I think, torn down, dismantled, and replaced. And so now Trump is going after the FBI for his own reasons. And his own reasons have nothing to do with the FBI's history of abusing and trying to misdirect and destroy the left. Trump doesn't like the FBI because the FBI clearly came after him. They've had a almost 10-year-long campaign of sabotaging him. And so it's, what goes around comes around. And now he wants to dismantle the FBI, or he wants to, whatever. I don't know. Who knows if he's going to dismantle it, but he wants there to be significant reforms. And so Kash Patel promises to do this. Kash Patel's, his book is very explicit about wanting to transform the FBI and take it out of DC and depoliticize it. If people aren't aware, if listeners aren't aware of the kinds of stuff they did against Trump, the FBI uses, it begins in the, 2016, that campaign where the Clinton campaign funds a private company, Fusion GPS, out of the UK that does opposition research to do opposition research on Trump. And that creates the Steele dossier, which is full of these unsubstantiated wild claims that become the basis of the Russiagate hysteria. The FBI knows that these are not true, yet recycles them, like releases parts of the Steele dossier into the DC rumor mill, and then reports on the rumors as if they're real evidence, and uses the rumors to get FISA warrants, total of 4 FISA warrants, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrants, to spy on the Trump campaign and go after various Trump connected people like Carter Page and, Mike Flynn and these types of people. And then there is the most egregious thing that they do, because it's not just an attack on Trump, it's an attack on democracy, which is the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story. So the facts are, and this is something that the left doesn't want to deal with. They just don't want to cover this. They act like this hasn't happened, but this is true. This has been verified. Hunter Biden he abandons his laptop in 2019 at a Delaware repair shop. I think it's like the late summer. And he's in the middle of, after years of sobriety, spinning out of control. His brother has just died of brain cancer. And, the guy had a horrible childhood. His mother and his sister were killed in a car accident. It's like really, and then his father goes off and is like a senator and is just like in the Senate all the time. So it's like, nothing against Hunter Biden. I understand why he struggles. Anyway, amidst this relapse, he abandons his laptop. The laptop owner makes all efforts to get in contact with him, and he's abandoned it. And so then the laptop owner he's going to refurbish the laptop to resell it. And he already has the data somewhere else. And he's going through the data and realizing, wait, this is Hunter Biden's laptop. And it's not about the sex and drugs that are captured there in photographs and all that kind of stuff. But there are also all of these emails that clearly show that Hunter Biden was engaged in influence peddling in Romania, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and China, where he's basically selling access to his father. And the most egregious example of this is in Ukraine, where he's hired by Burmisa, which is the largest natural gas company in Ukraine. And they're under investigation by the government for corruption of what sort, I don't quite remember, but kickbacks, that kind of thing. And so they hire Hunter Biden for $1 million a year, like $83,000 and change a month, to help them. And they put him on the board. And his main task is to get his father, this is in 2014, his father, then vice president to Obama, is the point person for the Obama administration on the Ukraine desk. And they want the prosecutor who's going after them removed. And sure enough, Joe Biden does show up in Ukraine. And we know this because he brags about it on video, right? That he goes there and he demands that this prosecutor be fired, or there won't be a USAID grant of whatever it was, some large sum of money wouldn't be dispersed. And so the Ukrainian government fires this prosecutor, and Burmisa is alleviated of this problem of this corruption investigation. And the FBI, so the guy who has the Mac shop, gets a little freaked out about the fact that this is Hunter Biden's laptop. He attempts to give it to the FBI through his father, who's a former Air Force colonel who lives in Arizona. And the FBI office there says, get out of here. We're not interested in this. So they then raid. So this is in the autumn of 2019. December 2019, the FBI raids the laptop repair shop and they seize the content of the laptop. They tell him, they warn the guy, they say, people who don't say anything about this, usually nothing happens to them. And so he's really scared. And that warning has the opposite effect. And he feels that he has to get some exposure on the fact that he is privy to this information so that he's not, killed somehow. That's his fear, it seems. So the FBI then, and so what he does is, and maybe he also does this because of his own political proclivities. We don't know. I suspect he's probably a Republican. He gives the laptop content to Rudolph Giuliani at some point in late 2019, early 2020. And Giuliani's like
Giuliani.
the Rudy Giuliani, right? Like at one time, like personal kind of like lawyer. I think he was officially one of Trump's lawyers, like an old friend, confidant of Trump's and a partisan. And so Giuliani's like, this is amazing. This is our October surprise. We're going to hold this and we're going to come out like 2 or 3 weeks before the election. And I mean, this is going to be devastating, right? And Giuliani eventually at some point, we don't know when, gets this to Miranda Devine at the New York Post. And Miranda Devine will, in fact, 2 weeks or 3 weeks before the election, publish the story. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So what happens is that the FBI then in early 2020, having confirmed that the laptop is real, they get a FISA warrant to check it against Hunter Biden's iCloud storage. And they see like, okay, this is real. Already it was like, nobody's denying this stuff. Well, it hasn't come out yet publicly. It's all still secret at this time. So then the FBI starts having meetings with social media companies, and like 30 such meetings in which they start pre-bunking the laptop story. They say, we expect that there's going to be a Russian disinformation campaign, an election interference campaign targeting our election. We think it's going to involve claims about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and their corruption. It will involve hacked information. So this could be illegal for you to handle. And, and so they get the entire media ecosystem primed. And so when Miranda Devine's story does drop, then it is immediately censored. The New York Post's whole Twitter account is canceled for 2 weeks in the run up to the election. It becomes impossible to share this story on basically all the social media platforms. And that is the result of the FBI assiduously campaigning and meeting and pre-bunking this story. That strikes me as really outrageous, really egregious, because that's election interference. That's not just going after this guy, Trump. That's affecting all of our ability, our right to know what the hell's going on with these presidential candidates. So there's that. And then, of course, Trump loses the election, and Republicans are furious about this because by their calculation that only 45,000 votes total across about 5 or 6 different states, and the election would have gone differently. And there's one polling agency that's a right-leaning polling agency does a study, and they find with, less than 2,000, it's like 1,700 Democrats. They find that the majority of their respondents said, had they known this, they would have not voted for, or a significant portion of them say they would not have voted for Joe Biden. They probably would have stayed home, right? So they say, look, they stole the election with this. Who knows? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but it's messed up what the FBI did. Then under the Biden administration, right, the lawfare continues against Trump, most egregiously around like the Mar-a-Lago raid, where Trump is accused of having retained classified documents. Now, keep in mind that Biden at the same time has this issue come up. He has classified documents that he's retained from his vice presidency that are just sitting in his garage in front of his car at home in Delaware. And it's not like Trump wasn't cooperating with the FBI and the National Archives. There were like 3 different batches of documents that he gave back. By all accounts, the documents that he took with him were completely chaotic mess with classified and unclassified documents mixed together that he had like for props. It seems like that, you had like these files, like, oh, this file is top secret, but not necessarily anything in it, so it's like just a complete mess. And he's like trying to go through and pull out classified documents. And the FBI have visited Mar-a-Lago and received documents from his lawyers and this kind of stuff. But yeah, nonetheless, they have this raid against him. And then there's 38 charges against him for that. And there's all the other lawfare and stuff like that. So those are the reasons that Trump is going after the FBI. And some of those, I go into some detail on that because here in this conversation with you, because it's important for people on the left to be aware of that this is not just kind of like hysterical nonsense on the part of Trump. The FBI was doing stuff that should be illegal if it's not. I mean, I think it is illegal what they did. And so that's why Trump wants to get the FBI. But I'm supportive of the efforts of his administration to reform, strip down. I don't think they're going to get rid of the FBI. I think they're just going to probably try and purge it and reform it. And I think the left should be trying to intervene. I mean, I have no expectation that the left will do that. I think that's completely beyond the left's capacity right now. But it would be nice if we forced the history about COINTELPRO and reminded people what the details that came out of the church committee were and these sorts of things. COINTELPRO was revealed not by the church committee, but because there was a break-in at Media, Pennsylvania, an FBI office where all these documents that revealed COINTELPRO were taken. And the story, I haven't looked into this too closely, but the story was always that like people associated with the Weather Underground or something like that broke in. But then I remember reading a couple of years ago that apparently some like sort of religious lefty, like a Mennonite or a Brethren, a woman who was in the Brethren or something like that, or the Mennonites, stole all this stuff. Like she worked there and she absconded with it. And like her sort of deathbed confession was like, there was no break-in. Like I stole the documents. You can Google that. I don't know. Who knows if that's true? Who knows? Anyway, whatever the case, they did get all these documents out of the Media, Pennsylvania FBI office. And that's how we learned about all of the dirty tricks of COINTELPRO. And that's one of the things that helped lead to the church committee hearings in 1977. And there was also, the CIA was part of that because there was Operation Chaos where the CIA was spying on the New Left and that was exposed. And there was when William Colby, no, wait, was it William? No, it was not. It was Schlesinger under Nixon. So Kennedy fires Dulles over the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and then Kennedy is assassinated. And Richard Helms steps in his place. And then Nixon fires Helms and replaces him with Schlesinger. And Schlesinger, I'm forgetting Schlesinger's first name. He's not related to the New York Times like Arthur Schlesinger. He wants everyone, he calls on people in the agency to come forward with all of like the problematic dirty tricks and what becomes known as the family jewels. People come forward with all sorts of illegal activity and all this, the family jewels then becomes kind of major liability. And when William Colby comes in, he gets rid of all that, I think. But this leads to the, stuff leaking out about this leads to, and Seymour Hersh breaking the stories about this and stories about chaos. This leads to like 2 or 3 kind of lame commissions, the Rockefeller Commission and something else. And then that concerns about CIA spying in the U.S. is also part of like the Pike Committee and the Church Committee hearings. And, you can search around, you can find those, the reports, the Church Committee report, PDFs of it are out there. It's like, 300 or more pages. And I wonder how often people go through that. Because of course, what has happened is that the left has really turned its back on this whole history. This gets back to the question of the deep state. I am shocked that people are so hostile to the idea of the deep state, but the idea that there's this unaccountable scenes and networks in the government that people who support democracy need to be struggling against because they're thwarting democracy and they're distorting policy and they're unaccountable. And they blackmail and intimidate and control, not perfectly, but they attempt to control elected politicians, right? So, in this whole term, the deep state, it comes out of the left. It's Peter Dale Scott who brings it into the English language from Turkish. And in Turkish, it's used to refer to these networks of Kemalist officers, right? Like as in Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And that they're like in threats from the left, the Marxist left, and sort of a little bit later, increasingly the Islamist right, these conservative Republican Turkish officers had this like deep state, this like networks within the state where they were prepared to, have coup d'etats if necessary, rather than let these other forces take control of the government, right? And
Mhm.
there were, I think there's something like with successful coups and failed coups, it's something like, I think 6, but there's 2
Yeah, I
successful
can recall
coups.
the 2 ones in particular. One where, like, a leftist government that was elected had to step down, and one where a Islamist government was elected and had to step down.
Mhm.
And it's like, I guess the deep people think, like, what's the difference between the deep state and the administrative state? Because every country has an administrative state now.
Yeah.
But, like, the deep
Well, I mean,
state, what
yeah.
you're getting at is, like, it actually intervenes in elected politics. That's kind of the whole point. It
And
undermines.
it's secret.
Yeah.
It's secret and it's illegal and it uses emergency and it goes extra constitutional. I mean, the administrative state is that fourth branch of government that implements the law, which is accountable to the judiciary, to the executive and the legislative branch. I mean, it's vulnerable to that. It's not like secret, right? It's like they're the bureaucrats who are like, we make the rules. And eventually, Congress will say, like, you've got too many rules around this, that, or the other thing. We're coming
Well,
in here and we're like, we appreciate your efforts to administer education, but I mean, this is about to happen with the Department of Education, and it's like,
mm,
and this is also going to be difficult because there's a lot that the Department of Education does that I'm not in favor of. I mean, the Department of Education kicks in only May of 1980. And the key things that the Department of Education does that are really important and good is it redistributes money to these under Title I, which is a different piece of legislation that's like predates the Department of Education to like get money to poor schools, and it administers the student loans to students and stuff like that. So it has these important redistributive functions, but there's also a ton of BS that they do. And like the culture of academia and even of regular public education is getting so bureaucratized. It's like, I'm not in favor of undoing the Department of Education, but I'm not going to pretend like, oh, everything the Department of Education does is sacred and good. It's like bullshit. A lot of it is like pushing technology that is like harmful, unnecessary at best, harmful at worst, pushing endless bureaucracy. I mean, the bureaucratization of education has to be seen to be believed. It is astounding the kinds of totally dysfunctional make work garbage that they're coming up with. And as a result, it's, since the Department of Education has been created, like in universities, we have gone from where it used to be like 3 faculty for every 1 administrator, and now it's 1-to-1. It may even have crossed the line where there are more more administrators than there are faculty. And
mhm.
it's not at all clear what these people are doing, other than consuming tuition dollars and tax dollars. So anyway, but the administrative state, that's the administrative state for better and for worse, right? I'd like to see less bureaucracy in the Department of Education, more enforcement power at the EPA, but those agencies aren't secret, and the right hates them because they regulate business. And they've been working away, like take the EPA, right? They want to eliminate the EPA. They want to, and they have effectively hobbled the EPA. I mean, then I forget off the top of my head, but the number of investigators at the EPA is like, in the low hundreds, not adequate for such an enormous economy as ours, like to have so few investigators to actually go and look and see and sample the water and like, well, what's good? Well, these claims that these workers and these residents of this place are making to us and persisting and demanding that like something be done. Like, you have to have people to go and test the waters. Like, is this company violating the law? I mean, I'd like to see more of that part of the administrative state and less of the bureaucratic nonsense. But what I'm going far afield. The point is the administrative state operates out in the open and is accountable to courts and the other branches of government. The deep state has parts of it that are out in the open, but it does things illegally, secretly, off the books, and it intervenes in politics. And its dependence on secrecy is anti-democratic, and it's part of what makes it very dangerous and why it has to be dealt with. I don't think there's a lot of hope for progress through democratic politics if we don't prune back this deep state, which is just like a snowball, just continues to develop capacities and cultures. And I think it's really important. I know some people on the left that I've spoken with, say, well, they're just going to replace it with something else. Well, that might be, but we should work to prevent that. In the meantime, like the hypothetical that they might just replace it with the same thing or something worse isn't going to get me to defend the FBI. I think the FBI needs to be stripped down, and we need massive transparency. We need, I hope that they disgorge enormous amounts of documents. I really hope that is the case. Thus far, like, this Doge kind of raid on USAID, they have not been disgorging documents. What they present is pretty flimsy. One can go to usaspending.gov and you can get all the grants, but it's pretty complex, and you kind of have to know what you're doing to corroborate some of these charges that are being made. But, Elon Musk and Doge and the Trump White House are not presenting dossiers of primary documents like the contracts themselves. I mean, they're basically, making these statements and then like linking to, Washington Examiner articles. I mean, that's pretty flimsy. So
I think the important thing you're getting at is not so much assuming that Trump will, democratize the FBI or anything. Who knows what will happen, because we haven't seen it happen. Who knows, by the time this is out, maybe something will happen. But the big point you're getting at is like the people who are defending these institutions in reaction to Trump is just ridiculous. And that's something I've noticed as a broad trend with the left under Trump, is this sort of Trump derangement syndrome, where a lot of leftists become kind of defensive of like institutions they would previously absolutely not support. Like Bernie Sanders wanted to abolish the CIA. Like he's on videotape in the 90s saying that.
oh, really?
And
Well,
imagine if Kennedy was going to crack down on the FBI, and wouldn't have that been a good thing? I mean, given kind of like what the FBI was doing in that period, and especially after that period, like after he was replaced, after he was cracked.
no,
But I think a lot of these problems deal with, because like, of course, when we say the left, you're not talking about leftists like yourself or like, serious like Marxists or anti-imperialists. You're talking about a lot of like the mainstream progressive left. And those people, I think the big problem is like they're just tied to the
also like Marxists and anti-imperialists seem to be silent on this sort of stuff.
Some
I
of them.
haven't checked Jacobin in the last week or so, but like I suspect they're not saying much about this. I don't know. Maybe I should keep my mouth shut. Maybe they have something good up about, attacking USAID, but
I would say Jacobin's gotten a lot better.
That's
in
good.
the past 4 years, I think. But like the big thing is that the left is so tied to the Democratic Party, so that they see everything in lesser evil terms. So they see that like giving into the right-wing attacks on the Democrats is going to like help Trump win. And you're framed as enabling Trump if you talk about the Hunter Biden stuff.
The issue with the Hunter Biden laptop is not him smoking crack, and it's not him with prostitutes. It's the emails in which he's, saying stuff like, 10% paid to me, and then 10% for the big guy also paid to me. I mean, like we're like explicit, like this is the money that's going to go to my family. And then some of the other stuff where he's scolding his niece or something about, he's like, I've made all the money for this family for 30 years. And you're like, what the heck has been going on with the Bidens? Those are the issues. But no, and like, I mean, seeing Ilhan Omar, she was one of the squad who had some principle in some of these foreign policy votes, voted against, she voted against the funding for the Iron Dome, Israel's Iron Dome, when AOC did vote for it, her and Rashid Tlaib. And I don't know how she voted on Ukraine aid. But anyway, then you see Ilhan Omar out there defending USAID, and it's like, that's disappointing.
Well, like the biggest proof of Biden's corruption is the fact that he like pardoned his family for leaving.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just blatantly the case. And he was thinking like, well, Trump's going to do it, so I guess I might as well do it,
Right. And he pardons his son back to 2014, because that's the Burisma stuff. Yeah.
It's like, like I think there might be dangers that like Trump stacks the FBI with people who are totally partisan to him. But that is kind of what was already happening with the Democrats to some extent in terms of like not so much packing the FBI, but like definitely partisan coordination with the whole Russiagate thing. Like the Russiagate
Hmm.
stuff was blatant lawfare on behalf of the Democrats. And, you got the Mueller report. Like
Yep.
that's kind of a Democratic, sort of propaganda op
Yep.
that
Yep.
didn't end up going anywhere because it didn't have much
Yeah.
evidence.
Yeah. Yep. And yeah, I mean, this whole thing, I mean, yeah, Trump derangement syndrome is real, and it has pushed the left into the Democratic Party. And so then you have all these Marxists and anti-imperialist types who vote for the Democrats and that, have Trump derangement syndrome 100%, but then they feel like they're not guilty of supporting all of the stuff that the Biden administration did, like the Ukraine war and, mass murder in Gaza, because they're critical of it. It's like, yeah, but you campaigned for this guy, you supported it. And so I'm just like, I'm not worried. I'm not sure that Trump is going to be worse than Biden. I mean, I thought that his foreign policy first time around was better than what the Democrats put up afterwards. That's for sure. So who knows?
I would
And
agree with everything but Israel. I think in his Trump's Israel policy is slightly worse only because of his like connections to Netanyahu and being
well,
very
we'll
like
see. I
favorite
mean,
for everyone.
we'll see. Like his thing about Gaza is totally insane, right? And disgusting, but it's also not going to happen. Thus far, the ceasefire holds. He did get a ceasefire. It was like Wickoff went in there, got a ceasefire. I don't know. It'll probably be very, very bad. I mean, Trump is 100% behind Israel. But I read Jared Kushner's biography, and Jared Kushner, who was personally knows Netanyahu. Netanyahu stayed at the Kushner's house during the 90s when Jared Kushner was a teenager, and Netanyahu was in the States raising money or,
Mhm.
And lobbying, stuff like that. But it's clear from that book that the Trump that Jared Kushner and Trump felt burned by Netanyahu because their whole thing was the Abraham Accords, right? Like Jared Kushner was working on this secretly. And the Abraham Accords, just to be clear, is like terrible for the Palestinians. They were like, step one was forget the Palestinians, right? Throw the Palestinians overboard. But it was like their whole thing was trying to get normalization with Israel and all these other states. And the point here is not for you to like the Abraham Accords or anything, but just to understand them, right? And like the big thing they really wanted, they've got, Egypt to normalize relations with Israel. They got Qatar to do it right. They wanted Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize relations. And according to Kushner, was like the Saudis seemed ready to do it because they have more money than God, and Israel has technology and companies, and they were like, let's do this. And it was Netanyahu who thwarted that, and that was the difference in the eyes of Kushner and Trump between the Abraham Accords being this truly transformative thing and kind of like, a nice try. So who knows,
So
maybe.
why? Well, I was gonna say why Kash Patel specifically is somebody to be somewhat enthusiastic about. Like, who is Kash Patel for the audience,
Right.
and what
Well,
credentials do you have that
yeah.
make
I mean, he's a working class.
a good candidate for the FBI in terms of
Yeah.
cleaning up corruption and
Yeah.
just more authoritarian tendencies and stuff?
He is the son of working class Indian immigrants. He's raised in Queens and on Long Island. He goes to law school. He's thinking of becoming a doctor, but he realizes that's kind of not his forte. And as a caddy at a golf club on Long Island, he caddied for these defense attorneys, and he was sort of captivated by their stories. And so after law school, he becomes a defense attorney for 8 years down in Miami-Dade County, which is one of the really like best defense in terms of like winning and, getting people off of the charges. They have a very, very high rating. They're hard charging, tough public defender's office. So he's a public defender, and that's like a very left-wing job. He's never left-wing. He has described his parents as Democrats because they were immigrants or are immigrants, and that he was raised basically apolitical, but he goes kind of right-wing in college, but he ends up as a criminal defense attorney in an office where there's, a fair bunch of leftists and some solid, like hardcore leftists among them, not just liberals. But then he goes from there and he works for the Justice Department, and he's involved in like counterterrorism prosecutions and that sort of stuff. And along the way, he develops this distaste for the FBI. And he explains all this in his somewhat uneven book, Government Gangsters. But that in a nutshell is sort of, who he is. And there's a way in which he brings this defense attorney ethos to the politics of the FBI, and his connection to Trump, I argued in that piece, is sort of like that of a defense attorney to their client. And the position of a defense attorney is, behind closed doors, is not like always my client is innocent. It's, what? It is the job of the state and the accusers, not the accused, to prove this, right? Like these accusations, they have to prove it. And my job is to attack and make sure that the government's case against my client is actually as strong as they say it is, right? Like the defense attorneys sort of see themselves as like the wolves making sure the herd of elk are healthy by like taking out the weak ones, right? It's like, it doesn't matter at a certain level if your client is guilty. Even when your client is guilty, the defense attorney has this sort of larger job of constantly testing the system. You're constantly stress testing. It's like, really, are you handing over all the exculpatory evidence as part of, what do they call that? I'm spacing out on it. Discovery, these kinds of things. So, these procedures, right? And it's like, and clearly a lot of those rules were broken when it came to Donald Trump. And so Kash Patel has that kind of like bulldog defense attorney sensibility, which is like, hey, never mind what kind of person my client is. What's up with this evidence you're putting forward? Is this real? What happens if I kick it really hard? Does it fall apart? Or are you telling the truth?
So what should the left's position on this be? Like, given that they're not really in power,
I think we should be in favor of like basically tearing down the FBI and replacing it with something else. And that we should be saying like we don't want to turn it into just a pro-Trump institution, but like this is an opening, like, and specifically like what we need is like massive disclosure of files, right? I think that the best thing that can happen is for the more information is pushed out into the public, the more accountability there is in this whole process, right? If the process is people like Kash Patel saying, oh, we found some bad stuff and now we're going to make these decisions over here. It's like, no. You got to show us the receipts. Everything has to come out. Show it all to us. And then we'll decide, and we can, based on the same evidence that you're looking at, decide what the merits of your decisions are, right? And the FBI has been up to all sorts of nasty, duplicitous, illegal stuff for decades and decades, and we need to get it out there. And that culture needs to stop and needs to be crushed and dismantled and gotten rid of, right? And so, and a very, very important part of that involves the public and disclosures, right? And a change of attitude among the voters and among the people, so that someone like Kash Patel finds himself in a situation where he must do the right thing because there are too many people reading the same documents, and if he starts drifting, say, wait a minute, this is not that you were in violation of all the stuff you once said. Like, look, people are going through these documents. We see what's going on here. And this kind of bullying and fixing evidence, all this stuff has to be dealt with. I mean, there's so much of this, the FBI is constantly entrapping people and framing people, all of which is legal. I forget when it is. I think it's like the late 70s. I think it's a case in 1978 when that becomes legal. But it used to be illegal to frame people, that In the case, as I recall, I don't remember the name of it. I'm not a lawyer, but it was a case involving a shotgun. And it was either an FBI or a DE, ATF, maybe ATF wasn't even around then, but I should know that given that I've written a lot about criminal justice. But some federal agent is selling somebody an illegal shotgun, and they say, hey, well, would you like the barrel cut off? I could make this sawed off. And the subject of the sting says, okay, yeah, that's great. A sawed off shotgun would be even better. And that then increased the penalty considerably because sawed off shotguns at that time were illegal, right? So it was like the illegal sale of a legal style of weapon was transformed into an illegal sale of an illegal style of weapon, right? And that case was the test case where it was legalized to entrap people because the defense was like, wait a minute, if the federal agent hadn't suggested to the purchaser of this illegal gun that they could very easily turn it into a sawed-off shotgun for the purchaser, that crime of buying a sawed-off shotgun would never have happened. Like, this is a crime that was invented by the federal government. And it was found to be, okay, that's fine, that's legal. And prior to that, it was, you couldn't do that. Federal agents could not entice people into fake crimes and entrap them in fake crimes. They could lie and all of that, but the suspects had to be the progenitors, the authors of these crimes. It couldn't be, federal agents saying, hey, I have an idea. How about we kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, governor of Michigan, right? And that's what happens. Like that case where like this ragtag group of, poor, like right-wing kind of militia losers in Michigan are enticed by the FBI into attempting this crazy kidnapping of Gretchen Whitmer. And the people who are convicted are just terrified by the overcharging and they plea, right? Get like half the charges are dropped and they plead guilty to 20 years and maybe they can get out and, live the last 2-3 decades of their life as free people. But there were 2 or 3 of them who said, forget it, man. We're not pleading to this because this is all nonsense. And they fought it and they were exonerated because they proved to a jury that it was entrapment. And so that's the kind of stuff that goes on, and that should not happen.
Well,
They did this to Chokwe Antar Lumumba, who is Cooperation Jackson, which is a black nationalist, Marxist black nationalist formation in Jackson, Mississippi, and really other parts of the country as well. But they have in Jackson, Mississippi, organized there, and they have been a darling cause of the left for over a decade. And they had a mayor, the father of Chokwe Antar Lumumba, and he died of a heart attack. And then Chokwe Antar Lumumba was elected sometime after that. There was another government in there. And, Jackson, Mississippi is a very poor town. They've got these huge problems with the water supply being contaminated with lead. And, and Cooperation Jackson is doing what they can to try and organize among primarily the black community, but there are also, I went down there, pushing a decade ago now, and there are also, white people, a couple of white people who work with Cooperation Jackson, working class folks. Jackson, Mississippi is a pretty black city. Anyway, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, their mayor, is doing what he can, trying to deal with things, and he's just been arrested. The FBI framed him. They got some guys to go in there and pose as investors, that they were interested in vacant land that the city of Jackson had acquired. And nobody was particularly interested in because it was like, a brownfield site or whatever it was. It was just, nobody was buying it. And the city wanted to develop it and it was city property. And so, and they claim that somebody connected with or adjacent to Chokwe Antar Lumumba suggested to this fake company, which was an FBI company, that they should offer him $100,000 bribe. And they claim that they wined him and dined him and that he took this $100,000 bribe. But this is all the indictment. So who the heck knows what really happened, right? I mean, his defense, I have no idea, but his defense might be like, no, I did not take $100,000 bribe. This company offered $100,000 donation and I like directed it to my favorite charity or what, who knows what the details are when the defense happens. But I mean, this is a crime that the FBI invented. Now, maybe Chokwe Antar Lumumba takes bribes. I don't know. But this bribe that they have indicted him for was one that occurred because the FBI engineered it to happen. That kind of stuff is dirty, and it's been used against the left. I mean, Chokwe Antar Lumumba is a left-wing mayor.
Now,
it is used against the left.
Now, I usually try to avoid the whole, that's not leftist, it's a liberals excuse, because that is a very big excuse leftists use to deflect criticism. But I do think in this case, most like socialists proper, up until maybe Trump derangement syndrome, were largely in favor of dismantling the FBI. Like, especially in the Bush period. I mean, this was like the one thing I remember, like, libertarians and leftists could always, have a beer over. Like, you could be like, yeah, we both
Yeah.
hate the CIA, brother,
Yeah.
like, so I think that is not that difficult of a pill to swallow for this audience, but definitely for like the sort of MSNBC pilled, like liberals or leftists who might be so Trump derangement syndrome pilled to the point where they're defending the FBI. And I think it seems to me the reason why they're in this position is they're under the impression that like Trump will stack all these institutions with his people, which could lead to sort of fascism. And that's kind of like the big fear you hear now. It's fascism, fascism. And I don't know to what extent maybe, look, I don't believe in the fascism theory because I don't think Trump is fascist ideologically at all. And neither are most people in his administration. But I think it is a fair point to suggest that maybe stacking all these institutions with his people could lead to an even more like kind of repressive regime than already exists if he uses those institutions to kind of do what's already been done before, but like 10 times worse and to his own political ends, which might be his ends.
Yeah.
Right.
If that happened and we, ideally we would have a movement that could prevent that from happening. But I mean, if the alternative is say, well, no, we should defend the FBI as it currently exists, corrupt, bullying, unaccountable, out of control, because there's this hypothetical. No, I don't buy that. Trump was president for 4 years and there were riots in the streets, which, I think we're going to find out there was a lot more FBI involvement and intel involvement in Black Lives Matter than we would like to acknowledge. I mean, we already know there was.
Yeah, like
There
you mean the
was
Molotov, like people throwing Molotov cocktails to like cause chaos and shit to like make the protest.
Yeah,
look
there
like
was a
that.
guy in one of my compact articles. I talked about it. It's this guy. I'm forgetting his name, but this dude shows up at like Black Lives Matter Denver, claiming that and maybe he did, like that he fought in Rojava with the PKK, the formerly Marxist, increasingly kind of like quasi-anarchist Kurds, followers of Murray Bookchin. I actually interviewed the PKK when I was a journalist in Iraq, and this commander I was talking to was really into. He was into Murray Bookchin and Emanuel Wallerstein, and I only name checked Emanuel Wallerstein I left out Murray Bookchin, which I regret because I was sort of like, oh, Murray Bookchin was just like, he was from Vermont. He was an anarchist, but I didn't know enough about Murray Bookchin at the time. I have more respect for Bookchin now than I did, but compression time, I only mentioned Wallerstein, but anyway, Bookchin was actually very important in this kind of like municipalization kind of quasi-anarchist thing after Öcalan, their leader, was captured by the Turks. Anyway, this guy claims that he'd gone off and fought with Rojava. He shows up in a hearse, like with guns. He's like, arming Black Lives Matter. And of course, it's like immediately, activists are getting busted on gun charges. This guy was an FBI plant. There's stuff like, I think we'll see. There's probably a lot more of that if we're so lucky as to see the documents coming out. And anyway, but the point is, Trump is president as there are massive protests and riots and police stations are overrun and burnt. Grand Rapids had a police station overrun and burnt. Seattle, a couple other places. You have the Taz, the Chaz, the Seattle Capitol Hill Temporary Autonomous Zone, where a bunch of guys following this like rapper named Raz Simone have like formed an armed militia, but with a bunch of, again, Rojava vets in the lead. They are patrolling the Chaz. They kill two, or maybe they kill one and wound another, like 15 and 14-year-old kid who are joyriding in some stolen car. It's like, I mean, this stuff is like pretty out of control. The cops abandoned the police station because the Democratic Party mayor ordered them to do that, right? If Trump were really a fascist, he had what he needed to be like, state of emergency, I'm sending in the 82nd Airborne. He didn't do that. He said to Governor Inslee and to the mayors, just get control of your cities, and then just ignored it. So this idea that like now he's really going to be a fascist, I don't buy that, because he had 4 years to be a fascist, and he had the excuse to be a fascist. These riots, police stations being overrun and burnt, like an armed militia patrolling openly at night in downtown Seattle. I mean, come on. That's a lot of people in America would have been like, well, he's got to do what he's got to do. I saw the footage of these guys with guns, He didn't do it. So I don't know. But it's not to say that Trump is a good guy. It's not to say that that an authoritarian replacement for the FBI could be developed. But I think that tearing down this 100-year-old agency is very important, and it's harder to rebuild things than it is to manage things that are going like this, and it needs to be stripped down. I mean, I don't think Kash Patel is going to try and wind up the agency. I don't think the Congress is going to defund the FBI, but there'll be a lot of structural changes in it. But yeah, I mean, I think there would be better outcomes if the left were pressing for things within this. And the thing I think the left should be pressing for is like, the people and the press demand to be part of this. And you must disclose the documents. You must publish. You must declassify vast amounts of documents. And Kash Patel has said that he wants to have, bureaus, I forget what his exact wording is, but he wants to have, offices of declassification running 24/7, right? So he says in his book, we need to be pressuring him to do that. If there's no one pressuring him to do that, maybe he'll back away from it when he's in charge of the FBI. And then the people he has to deal with are these FBI agents who are like, don't do that. I mean, come on, like what's in there about me, and et cetera, et cetera. So
I think the type of leftists who have the sort of fragility to any of this stuff on the basis that like, oh, it'll help Trump if we, enable any sort of agree with any rightists on anything. It's because their position is to take whatever the opposite position the right has. And I think that's the problem with people who define themselves solely as like leftists and not socialists, like not the system you want, not the kind of positive vision you're advocating for, but kind of like a leftist by itself. There's nothing really that unites all leftists other than an opposition to right wingers. Same with right being like a generic right winger, just hating the left. So when people define themselves that way, they get very easily caught up in just taking the opposite position of whatever the enemy has. But I think we could say like that type of leftist is kind of symptomatic of the kind of woke left that we're both critical of, and that's kind of what I want to get into now. Is your article, The Cargo Cult of Woke, which I think is a very more detailed analysis of wokeism than other people's analysis of it, because people think, oh, this is so 2016. How is wokeism a thing? Is it just a right-wing conspiracy? But you have this interesting take, which is that like wokeism is a kind of result, a product and a symptom of the decline and attack and defeat of class politics. So I want you to get into that.
Yeah. Well, so that's an article in Catalyst that Vivek Chibber asked me to write. It's a review essay, and he suggested 2 books, and I brought in a bunch of other books. And then it got very long, and I have a whole other half of it that hasn't been published. I don't think they'll be interested in publishing it, partly because it's too long, and also because I think that Vivek then did a podcast and got attacked by, the online left. And I think the the producer of that podcast is actually a graduate student in the John Jay economics program, where we have a master's program. And it's like, I got the impression from him that it was sort of like surprising for Vivek, but we might not be so eager to publish more on that subject. But yeah, and he was just attacked. I mean, it's just attacked in such a scurrilous and dismissive, awful way. It was disgusting. I mean, Vivek Chibber has been very important in Catalyst, in Jacobin. You know, he was very important. Bhaskar Sankara was going to do a PhD with Vivek Chibber. Vivek is a professor at New York University and didn't actually get in, or didn't get funding or something like that, believe it or not. I mean, and so then Bhaskar starts Jacobin, and now, you know, Bhaskar is the president of The Nation magazine, which means I think he runs the business side of it, you know, and he's a very impressive young guy. And so Vivek is very important to kind of the whole worldview of Jacobin. He creates Catalyst, and people are just attacking him because he has this critique, you know, a class critique of woke, like the one that you and I would share. And he's like dismissed as, you know, scum and not to be followed. And, just like, I mean, just scurrilous, baseless nonsense. So horrible, pathetic that someone who's as smart as Vivek and has worked as hard and has been so serious about the left and trying to build it and about creating platforms for a kind of mass intellectualism among socialists, I mean, that he could be dismissed that way is outrageous. Anyway, but I think he might be kind of not eager to keep publishing on that. But anyway, so what I argued in that piece was, that it's in the, it's about eclipsing class. It's anything but class. That this is the oldest of ruling class tricks, that you can find it in Madison's Federalist 10, right? In which he says, he's in Federalist 10, he's writing this article to argue for the ratification of the Constitution. That's what the Federalist Papers are. Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay write these articles that are then later collected as the Federalist Papers. And in Federalist 10, Madison is speaking to elites who are worried that political democracy will lead to economic democracy. And Madison says, well, that could happen, but here's the thing. Faction will prevent that. And, faction occurs naturally. And by faction, he just means division, division by geography, by religion, various types of, adherence to this leader or that. I mean, division, social divisions of any sort. He says, the only risk is if that source of faction, which is the most important and the most prevalent, which is the division between the haves and the have-nots, like that becomes the unifying source of faction, then the majority can get together. If they can overcome the other sources of faction that divide them and unite as this single large faction, what we would say class of propertyless people, then they can use the political apparatus that we're proposing in this Constitution to impose economic democracy. But that's very unlikely to happen because there's so many other natural forms of division, i.e. faction, that divide people. Geography, religion, adherence to this leader, that leader, whatever. And also, you can lean into that. You can encourage faction, right? And so he's saying that's what's going to happen. It's like the majority of propertyless people are never going to get together and use democracy to take your wealth from you because there's just too much faction, right? So, I mean, that's the essence of what woke is. It's just like get people to think about anything but class, keep them divided against themselves. And that is what is unpacked in that article. But then in the second half, which hasn't been published, which will be published somewhere, I go through the history of it specifically. And, I mentioned this to you previously that, I begin with Taft-Hartley after World War II, when there's a law pushing back against the New Deal, right? And this makes sympathy strikes and boycotts illegal. It makes it illegal for socialists and Marxists to be officers in trade unions in the United States. That portion of the law is eventually overturned about 5 or 6 years later because it's found to be a violation of the Constitution's prohibition on bills of attainder, which, were an 18th century style of law where the legislature could just declare, Tony of one dime is an outlaw, no habeas corpus for this guy. We have passed a law declaring this guy an enemy of the state, right? So that's made illegal by the Constitution. And so eventually socialists are allowed back into the trade union movement as employees, but the damage is done. So Taft-Hartley, by stripping away many of the tools used by organized labor to really build class consciousness, because if you practice solidarity, like, a whole sector going out on strike because one factory in their sector, one employer is not, working, playing nice with their union, so the whole sector, all the textile factories go out or whatever, like that kind of thing becomes illegal. Sympathy strikes, the Teamsters, refusing to service factories or ports where there's a strike, and boycotts, right? If you don't practice class solidarity like that, then the consciousness begins to change. And what develops out of Taft-Hartley is increasingly not a class consciousness, but what Lenin called guild consciousness, where it's sort of like business unionism. Members are concerned just about themselves and just what they can get.
Trade union.
So that's unique. Well, he called it guild consciousness.
Is that a separate thing from trade union consciousness? Because I remember
maybe he calls it. Maybe it's also trade union consciousness, but I always think it's guild consciousness.
Like the same thing from what you were describing. Yeah. I remember that in what
it's been a while since I've.
Yeah.
So then there's around the same time, there's another important precursor, like kind of, part of the history of woke kicks in, which is that the CIA and the State Department it's actually in 47, the CIA is not even existing yet, but it's the State Department and the Department of Defense occupiers in Europe start realizing that they've got this problem of a very widespread left, and that, eventually, late 40s and the 50s, the CIA is created in 48. And, then there's campaigns to steal the election in Italy and steal the election in France because the communists are looking like they'll be in government, at least as part of a coalition. So there's repression of the left, and they use the mafia and they use violence and they rehabilitate former fascists and all this kind of stuff. But there's also the problem, they realize they have to co-opt this left. They have to live with this left, that there's no way they can get rid of this European left. And so then the goal becomes, okay, at least we can probably peel large parts of this European left away from the Soviet Union. So we want to encourage an anti-communist left, and we can live with that. And so that's the whole cultural Cold War, Congress of Cultural Freedom, funding Encounter Magazine, funding the Paris Review, all this kind of stuff of like, funding an anti-communist left, which is accepting that there's going to be a left, but hopefully large parts of it will be as hostile to the Soviet Union as they are to the US. As part of that moment, there is increasing connection between the Central Intelligence Agency and philanthropic foundations. The CIA is using these foundations to pass money, to cover its tracks. And also there are philanthropic foundations that come to the CIA and say, we're interested in helping in the fight against communism. And that's, where this pattern of foundations funding left-wing organizations sort of really begins. I mean, there had been some of that earlier, like, Booker T. Washington and Du Bois. Like, I think, there was some like funding of like African-American politics in the 30s. But by and large, the philanthropic foundations in the 20s and 30s didn't fund social movements. The idea that philanthropic foundations fund social movements is really a post-war thing. So that starts happening. And that comes home in earnest with the Ford Foundation, or sort of most explicit and biggest, because the Ford Foundation is in, we're talking now like the 60s. I think it's something like half of all philanthropy was the Ford Foundation. It was enormous. It's still very, very big, but the whole sector has grown such that it's outsized. The ratio of the Ford Foundation, everything else has changed. And, what the Ford Foundation does, McGeorge Bundy goes from being national security advisor to Johnson to being head of Ford, and he funds Black nationalism, right? There's like the civil rights movement has won these legal victories. King has been assassinated. There's all these new social movements, and many of them are becoming much more explicit about their class politics, right? The Black Panthers, for example, are like, Black nationalists, but also Marxist and socialist. And some of them are very interested, like Fred Hampton, who's assassinated, in working with white and other, groups of color, but like, more interestingly, because as a Black nationalist, why would you work? A lot of Black nationalists are separatists at that time, not wanting to deal with white people, but Fred Hampton's like reaching out to working class white organizations in Chicago. So amidst that, Ford is all about channeling money into a kind of like race consciousness at the expense of a class consciousness, and also individualizing things, kind of pushing a kind of psychological sensibility that's about like uplift, and it's about, how you feel about yourself, as opposed to what are the material conditions for Black people in America? How do we address those, right? And the left, not only because of that, but that's an important influence, that kind of philanthropic funding. But the left also is affected by the general psychological turn that happens as part of the post-war deinstitutionalization, right? That psychology, psychiatry, these are bound up with institutions, mental hospitals and stuff like that prior to the war. And a lot of that stuff begins to, the beginning of deinstitutionalization begins. I mean, it really picks up pace in the 60s and the 70s. And instead of addressing really serious mental illness, psychology starts addressing, mere unhappiness. And there's a kind of massification of this. And so the role of psychology in everyday life is spreading throughout American society. And that affects the left, and you get this increasingly psychological sensibility, this increasing framing of political problems in psychological terms. One example of this are these consciousness raising groups that come out of actually Black nationalist scenes and are picked up by the radical feminists, the women's movement, and then spread to all various parts of the left. And, they're also to some extent influenced by the like Maoist struggle sessions and this sort of stuff. And so, there's also the rise of cults, which, there's probably, I think there's like definitely some deep state connections to some of that stuff, but it's also just a kind of organic thing that's going on. And so you have people like Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers, ends up being kind of like part of this quasi cult synanon. And, and so all of this is dragging the new left away from class politics. You have at the same time COINTELPRO, which targets most ferociously groups and leaders who have class politics and creates a vacuum for this other kind of identitarian, psychological, divisive politics to emerge. You have entering into this moment, late 60s, early 70s, the work of Gene Sharp becomes much more important. Gene Sharp is, in the wake of King, he becomes the sort of Pied Piper of revolutionary nonviolence, even though this guy is he does like 30 years at a think tank. That's his base at Harvard, he's not funded by the DOD, but the think tank is funded by the DOD. Kissinger is one of the directors of this think tank, right? And it's like, and so Gene Sharp is sort of pushing this sort of like anarchist type politics without the sophistication of anarchist traditions, really. And in today's activist direct action left, like this Sharpian politics are very prevalent, right? The movement for a new society is part of this kind of scene. They're very influenced by Sharp. My wife, Marcy Smith Parenti, wrote a great article about Gene Sharp, and then also about the movement for a new society. Those are both on non-site. So these are all the kind of like these are the layers that lead to the kind of politics that we now know as woke, in which politics is essentially reduced to a kind of etiquette, and the subjective aspects of politics are paramount. And, you end up with, sorry to use right-wing terminology, like the oppression Olympics, right? And the argument is not that, well, what about, these, these other kinds of oppression don't matter. No, that's not the argument. The argument is that you're never going to get the solution that most people need if you don't come together on a mass basis. And it's, so the irony of woke politics are that, yes, it is probably true that Black, trans, youth suffer unemployment and homelessness and other problems like that at a much higher rate than probably most other groups, right? But how are they going, such a small subset of the overall population in the United States, going to get their basic needs met, which is what they, when you actually look at, like, there's an organization out of the South that works on Black trans Southerners, and when you look at, like, I forget what it's called, but if you look at like, sort of, well, what do they want? It's like, they want better housing, jobs, and healthcare. And it's like, oh, okay, like the same thing everybody else wants, right? And it's like, the argument is not that, oh, Black trans people in the South need to park their concerns. It's that they're never going to get their needs met if it's all about just like this little subset. The fact of the matter is everybody needs this. So if everybody comes together, struggles for it, the great irony is that such victories, class victories, will disproportionately benefit those who are in fact most oppressed, right? So that's where we're at now, which is that people have a hard time seeing that and are instead, trained often by these nonprofits and these foundations. It must be said, not as some sort of conspiracy, but as a kind of cultural project, that foundations, when nonprofits colonized the left, that's the majority of organizations are nonprofits rather than kind of membership funded groups. And they always have these relationships with their funders that involve this sort of like cultural, bureaucratic, like, conditioning with this woke stuff, that groups that, you go to kiss the ring from your funders and it's like, oh, they're using pronoun check-in. So we got to do that too. And it's like, whatever the funders want, because that if you're going to be an executive director of a nonprofit, what you have to do is you have to kind of like learn the cues and mimic back to the funders what they want to hear. And they will even, they send out, they say, well, we're interested in funding at this ABC foundation, that foundation, whatever it is, like this issue this year. This is what we're funding. So if you're working on that, send us proposals. So like the executive director is like, oh, okay, it's not what they were funding last year. It's this. So let's rework our proposals to use this vocabulary list and mimic back to them, right? And so a lot of what these foundations push is this woke, this very divisive, psychologically obsessed woke sensibility. And that's where we're at. And it has succeeded in totally alienating large parts of the population from the left. The left looks like a freak show to many people. And it doesn't speak to a lot of the concerns of mainstream people, which are, bread and butter issues. And so that would be my rant on woke.
Well, that whole part about consciousness raising, I think, gets at the heart about what woke really is, because like stuff like identity politics, cancel culture, political correctness, we have an intrinsic intuitive sense as to why these are connected, but it's hard for a lot of people to articulate because it's difficult to articulate these things as connected phenomena rather than fully separate things. People will dismiss it and say, well, it doesn't, if you can't really explain it as a whole theory, then, it's just kind of a conspiracy or whatever. But like, I think the idea of what wokeism is in the word itself. I mean, people hate that word because they say, oh, the right uses it. We shouldn't use words right use. But I think it's not like a word the right uses. It's a word people use to describe the phenomenon because it accurately describes it. Because the whole idea behind woke is that like the presupposition is in order for a political change to happen, people need to be awakened in the correct way. This is like the whole consciousness raising part of it. Like
a very religious kind of nomenclature.
Yeah. And it's like, it's anti-political because it believes that people at the individual level have to be awakened to the correct ideas before change can happen. So it's not like, oh, we need to transform society in such a way that we can have social relations that will allow for a better flourishing human society, but rather that individual humans need to change their attitudes so that we can then go change things. And that's like the whole idea that, like, racism, it's not like a symptom of, class society and people being pit against each other. It's a matter of a correct attitude. You need to be taught to not be racist, or you need to learn the right pronouns. You need to be taught to accept different views of
Yeah.
whatever
And,
the
and
latest.
to be fair, there is, but there does need, people like, young
Yeah, I'm
white
saying
men
that
who are like oblivious. Like, it's like, you need to
no, we
learn,
need education for a lot of things.
learn manners and learn how to like share space with people. But like that itself isn't enough to,
It's not
uh,
politics.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
It's
There's tons of
etiquette, right? It's etiquette, and etiquette is important. Actually, etiquette is important because it makes people feel good. But etiquette is important because it gets things done. But then, what is it you're going to do? Just force etiquette on other people, or like
right.
eventually like restructure the tax code and expand, social provision of housing?
Yeah, like a lot of this boils down to what is the basis for politics, because you know it is obviously important to have an education system that teaches people about the nuanced realities that exist, right? Like whether that sex, gender, race, etc. But like as a basis of politics, people often do this thing where it's like identity politics. The problem is it was co-opted, in that real intersectionality is what we need. We just need to add class to this equation, and then it will be race, class, gender, etc. And I see
Yeah.
this come out of a lot of like PMC type leftists, professional managerial class types. And the thing is like, while this makes sense at the level of analysis, like in the way that demographic research might, like, of course, these things exist. There are different struggles, but how are you going to unite people based on a bunch of categories that you already kind of separated? From there, it's just people are going to build resentment against each other. So it's a kind of disastrous basis of politics. And yeah,
Yeah,
like you said, oppression Olympics. I mean, people want to act like that's not what it is. It
it
totally
is. Yeah,
gets into that.
the left is in really really bad shape. Yeah, and this thing about infection, and it's really demoralizing.
So I
Yeah.
was convinced by most of what you were saying, and it tracks with the history I've looked at. The only thing I'm not so sure about is I absolutely think because the thing about the CIA's involvement with the Congress of Cultural Freedom, that is a fact. I mean, there's a book, the Who Paid the Piper, that's written
Right.
on this that shows this in great detail. But I think that's like, I'm not sure if you would agree actually, is I see that as more of a symptom of the fact that that kind of left the CIA was propping up coincides with their interests, rather than like the CIA created this. I see it more as like a symptom of the fact that their interests align with the establishment, rather than the fact that the establishment is creating them. Because I think like
Well, no,
part
it's
of
about, yeah. I think what's important about it is the idea of misdirection and using the left, living with the left. That it's like, that the right wing, the state's project, the Cold War state's project, vis-a-vis the left, wasn't merely a project of repression and destruction. It was also a project of co-optation. And that's very important because, it was like COINTELPRO crushing the left, but it was also, they realized early on, like, you're never going to get rid of this. I mean, you're never going to get rid of the sources of discontent. In a class society, it's never going to be like suddenly, like, there are no more problems that cause people to question power and vast concentrations of wealth. That's always going to happen. So how do you manage this chronic condition? The left is a chronic condition. You can shrink it with repression, but you also have to have a strategy for living with it, right? And so that's what I think is interesting about that it's like a sophisticated kind of opening act of this like co-optation, living with, nudging,
Mhm.
managing. They don't create it.
yeah, they
You're
just
right.
kind
I
of
mean, it
push
exists,
this
but
direction.
they
It was
nudge.
hard.
They try to like, they encourage like that you go this direction,
Yeah, because I see the anti-communist turn in the left and the anti-Soviet as kind of separate things. I think it's kind of, I don't like
Right.
to put them together, because I think like the anti-Soviet part happened on its own just due to, well, one first was the archives that Khrushchev's secret
Yeah.
speech released, Then
You could say
the
that.
invasions of Czechoslovakia and Hungary just did
Yeah,
push a lot of people who were hopeful about reform in the Soviet Union.
but you
Up
could
yeah,
say
and then
that.
or the anti-communist stuff, I think, was kind of, like, after more, and, like, really, like, the fall of the Soviet Union is really what, like, makes, like, most of the left kinda anti-communist. I think, like, that's, like, the final death blow.
No, no, the left is very anti-communist prior to that. I was around for it,
Well, in America,
uh,
I think that's true, like the
yeah,
AFL-CIO, or some call it the
and
AFL-CIA. Yeah.
many other forms of the new left. And the new left was riven with kind of anti-communism. I mean, a lot of these people were, even as they were kind of radical revolutionaries of different sort, a lot of them were very anti-communist. I mean, you could say what you're saying is that, you're trying to subtextually assert the legitimacy of an anti-Soviet position because the Soviet Union had a lot of negative features to it. Fair
And
enough.
also,
It did. That
I don't
purge all
I'm
kinds
more
of. Wait. Let me finish.
yeah.
So it's like, but you could say the same thing about anti-communism. You could say, like, anti-communism was also organic. There were a lot of people who came to America from other countries where there was, like, serious oppression. They came in, okay, it's a class society, but there's also real opportunity, and you can work hard and get ahead. And there's, like, the New Deal and this and that. And they're like, I'm not interested in communism. Yeah, I understand what you guys are saying. That's not what I'm interested in. I don't want to live in a society where there's total equality. I want the ability to get ahead if I work hard. I want to own my own home. I don't want to live in public housing. Like, that's great for you. You roll out these stats about, like, public provision of housing and stuff. I don't want that. Yes, I'm working class, but I don't want that. I want to own my own home. And in this country, I can do that. And the fact of the matter is, even today, a lot of people own their own homes, a lot of working people, right? Less and less. But, in those golden years, like when the New Deal, effects of the New Deal are at its height, it's like, there's these subsidized mortgages, there's all sorts of stuff, right? So you could say, like, well, anti-communism is also organic. It's like there are elements of the working class and certainly the middle class who are like, I'm not interested in what you're selling, man. I'm not interested. Like, I'm okay with inequality. I just, I want pathways of opportunity. So
Well, that's 100% correct. I would fully agree with that. I mean, this is basically like, even Herbert Marcuse's analysis of, like, the US is, I mean, you can't deny the system in the post-war period just delivered the goods, right? So, like, when it was doing well, of course, people would be a little, like, weren't going to be as gung-ho about this communism thing. But I more mean, like, so I hear a narrative from Gabriel Rockhill, which is kind of, he has his articles about the theory industry and Frankfurt School and all kind of stuff. And
mhm.
he has this narrative, which is like,
I have not read
that,
enough of him.
well, his narrative is sort of like the left became anti-Soviet and anti-communist, and he kind of lumps that together as, like, the source of the problem of why the left is basically impotent. And I would agree in some sense, like, the abandonment of Marxism as an analysis and substituting it with these kind of identity struggles. But I don't think it would have been particularly helpful for the left to be more pro-Soviet. Like, if anything, like, you could get deported by being pro-Soviet. Like, the whole Red Scare made it so you had to even exist as, like, a left-wing academic. You you couldn't even be pro-communist. And if you were pro-Soviet,
You don't have to tell
you
me. My father was
yeah.
red baited out of academia for precisely this, for saying stuff like, you know, the Nicaraguan Revolution not only has democratic elections, they're more democratic than the American elections because they allow foreign countries to come in and have observers there and make criticisms and stuff like that. Yeah, and and he started writing for the Communist Party's publications, and I mean, he had a position at Brooklyn College, a 1-year position. They cut it in half in the middle of the year because it was like, this is in the '80s. This is like Marxists. Norm Finkelstein was in that department, political science department, when, and not that Norm Finkelstein had anything to do with pulling that. It was probably the chair of the department, but you know, it, you know, it might be, I think part of why I'm harsh on the left is also because in the Parenti household, that was actually a bigger part of conversation when I was growing up than you might realize if you read my father's work or just saw his lectures, because I remember him once saying he was, I mean, how betrayed he felt by the left because he was red baited out of academia primarily by the left for being too left wing, you know. And while he hated the system and he hated the university presidents, you know, who came after him hardest in the 70s, I remember him once saying, he's like, I kind of understood where they were coming from. And that was just, there was no hypocrisy or duplicity. It was like, these were like Republicans at the University of Vermont. That was one of many places he was run out of, University of Illinois. These guys were like, you know, like, we're not interested in having communists and Marxists in our political science department. And I don't want any professor in this university, you know, showing up in the newspaper carrying Vietnamese flags. You know, they just said it, right? They're like, this is America. Like, this is like that we have a different ideology. And it's like, that is what it appears to be. And he felt very betrayed by, you know, leftists who was always like, you know, it's like, you know, to like come to just like this like specific way and be left in a two left and like, you know, and so he was always running afoul of that kind of leftist by taking positions that I suspect you would not like, you know, being like defending the Soviet Union. But, you know, he also
Well, he's also critical. I actually like Michael
in Black Shirts
Parenti's-
and Reds. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like Michael Parenti's approach to the Soviet Union because he
But he
wasn't
will-
like
you know,
a
he-
total- he didn't buy into all the lies, but he also recognizes the faults. I found Black Shirts and Reds to be very balanced because he has that whole
You know-
communism in Wonderland chapter where he's critical, right?
Yeah. And, you know, I think it's important to, but anyway, so that's, you know, like that was a big part of the left, elements of the academic left, of trimming their sails, policing those to the left of them. So, you know, he was constantly suffering that, like, you know, unable to publish at the Nation, always getting kicked out of even lots of Marxist places. And partly it was because he was too close to the Soviet Union. And he was, to some extent, I mean, it was very pragmatic. You know, it was like, this exists. This is huge. This exists. He defended social democracy the same way because it was like, this exists. You could defend these programs here in New York City because they exist. You know, you don't descend from your theory to reality. You begin at reality, you know? And I mean, he defended socialist revolutions in the third world, not necessarily because they fit exactly what he liked, but because they existed. He supported the Cuban Revolution because it existed. He went down there in the 70s. In his FBI file, it says that the CIA kept tabs on him for that. You know, but he had criticisms of Cuban socialism. It's bureaucratized, it's, you know, I mean, a shit show in many ways. But like, he wasn't going to dismiss it because the idea like, well, I have a better idea about how socialism should work in Cuba. And so when they follow my ideas, then I'll support a socialist revolution in Cuba. It's like, well, you know what? That's never going to happen. Here's this island 90 miles from the US, and through some fluke of history, this totally charismatic guy, Fidel Castro, convinces a bunch of followers to do this totally insane thing that logically isn't going to work. And manages to sort of like bamboozle the US into like not realizing how Marxist the whole thing is. And, you know, and this happens and now it's underway. And so like, that's what's going on. And your choices are like that or being against that. You know, it's not like, well, my version, you know, from the abstract ether up here is something slightly different, right? So anyway, you know, I think it's important in terms of the Soviet Union, you know, yeah, there were a lot of problems with the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union was also evolving. And I feel the same way about the United States. Like, I think anyone who's like, you know, all you need to know about the United States is that there was slavery and genocide against Native Americans. It's like, that's an incredibly important part of understanding what the U.S. is and was. But that's not the only thing, right? That's not what it is now. And it has evolved and changed. And so too, the Soviet Union, it wasn't just like Stalin's purges. It evolved and changed. And ultimately, I think the reason it collapses is because it, you know, I'm partial to the analysis of David Kotz and Fred Weir in Revolution from Above, and that it creates a class society. It creates an elite that are a frustrated elite. You know, that if you were a member of the Communist Party in leadership, you lived better than if you were a janitor, right? Janitors, factory workers, frequently people are living in apartments where there's collective kitchens where it's up to like 5 families, but usually be like 3 families, you know, sharing a kitchen. Now, if you were, you know, a top engineer or, you know, a state-owned company or a political leader, it's like you lived kind of like not to put too fine a point on, like a professor at a public university might. You have a little apartment in the city and you could like get most books that you wanted. And on occasion, you didn't just have to drink vodka, but you could also get a bottle of scotch from someone who'd gone abroad and get a smuggled pair of blue jeans. And as opposed to going on vacation to the big sort of more collective, like the steel factory, everybody goes to the steel factory's vacation spot on the lake. You have like a small little dacha and a group of dachas. You're a little better off if you had access to a private car. But these people, especially in the second and third generation, lose their politics. They're the grandchildren and children of these heroes of the revolution. And many of them start dealing with their counterparts in the West. And they realize like, wow, if I was like the top geologist at this oil company, but it was a Dutch company or a British company or a Canadian or an American company, like access to a private car, I'd have a collection of cars. I could have an indoor heated pool. I could have like a huge house. I could have like a huge country house as well. It's like someone of my talents with my responsibilities in a capitalist economy would live like a freaking king. And here I am living like a professor, like at a public university, which is to say better than a worker, but like, not really what it could be. And so, I mean, they sold it out. They're like, forget it, man. Enough of them were like, let's just privatize this thing. And then as a result, you have this, like, it's one of the only revolutions where like 80% of the people in charge after the revolution were the people who were in charge before the revolution. So I think that's a big part of why it collapses. You have these ethnic tension on the edges, but it's like eventually, ultimately it is the leadership of the Communist Party in these republics who are like, forget it. We're going to just cash in.
Yeah, that's definitely, that is for sure part of it. Like that is undeniably part of it. That's a whole other topic we could get into. I think the point
you should probably have Fred Weir or David Kotz on to do that. I'm just reporting as someone who read the book.
It's not the same thing as The Revolution Betrayed, right? Or Socialism Betrayed. There's one book called Socialism Betrayed.
No, it's Revolution from Above.
Revolution from Above. Okay.
Yeah.
So
forget the publisher.
Yeah. The point that I'm kind of raising is like, I'm all for like a balanced analysis, right? Like there's an analysis that looks at the pros and cons of any system, right? And I think there was many, like most radical leftists really supported, for example, like the Russian Revolution. It was only like anarchists who kind of abandoned it pretty earlier when they realized that they couldn't dance in it. To quote Emma Goldman, this can't dance in the revolution. I don't, whatever. But it's like not until like way later that leftists more really kind of lose hope. I mean, even like Trotsky, he's a critic of the Soviet Union, but he defends it the whole way through till he dies. It's not till like way later where people start kind of losing hope. And the thing that I would say is like, I think it's important to have a non-utopian analysis of things in the sense that like your criticism of the type of people who like denounce anything that was ever tried and will only support things that kind of seem like they would work hypothetically or maybe work for a couple of months, like, anarchist Catalonia or whatever. So I think there's an important to have that like realist analysis. But also, in the United States, I think there would be a difference from defending the Soviet Union in a balanced way and then kind of importing the ideology of the Soviet Union and try to advance that in America, which would be Marxism.
Yeah, well, I don't think
it would have ever worked in America. It just wouldn't have worked at the level of just people wouldn't have ever bought it.
People did that, but I'm not an expert in these things. But just I'm not an expert in these things, and I'm not actually particularly interested in them at all. I mean, I find it depressing to think about this stuff, but I mean, I don't think that's what the U.S. Communist Party was like trying to be extra American. They were like frumpy, nerdy kind of. Yeah. I mean, now they're just basically Democrats. I mean, they really are just like. But whatever, man. It's like the left. It's like
I think Eugene Debs.
My mind starts to glaze over at a certain point with these kinds of conversations. It's like I don't know what to tell you, man. I mean, I don't think there's much point in too much attention being paid. This kind of like Marxology thing is something that like, young people want to get into. That's fine. Do that. But like, I can't go there with people. I've never really been into that sort of like forensic
Alternative
Um,
history.
but
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, like, the reason I bring it up is because I do see there's a lot of people who are followers of your father's work who will kind of pick and choose parts they like of, especially of of the speeches, and try to then they'll be out here like defending Stalin and stuff, and but then they'll take like, Michael Parenti's lectures, a legendary lecture, the yellow one on Cuba. I remember that's one of my favorite ones, the yellow one. Yeah, yellow. They call it yellow Parenti. That's what the streets call
yeah,
it. And they'll pick that, and then kind of like jump to this weird conclusion that like there was actually nothing wrong with Marxism, Leninism, and that like the correct form of leftism that was lost is Marxism, Leninism. And I don't know, I'm kind of skeptical of that and the way, because like it doesn't seem to me that's what your father was really advocating. Like he was definitely a communist, but like in
yeah,
his like communism and the black shirts and reds impression I sort of got, correct me if I'm wrong, like was like learning from the failures and the successes, right?
yeah. I mean, I don't know if if he was particularly sophisticated in his recommendations for American social movements. He was not a social movement theorist. He participated in social movements. He supported revolutions in the global South. Not all of them. He was also, critical of, like, you know, of he didn't like that the Chinese were against the Soviet Union. I mean, my interpretation of him, and I mean, I didn't necessarily like. I haven't read everything he's written, and I mean, I heard all this stuff growing up, and I got kind of sick of hearing this shit all the time. Sometimes we'd have conversations about it, but someone's just like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, you've said that a bunch of times." But and he wasn't, I mean, he wasn't. He didn't. He was not a Marxologist. Like that was not what he concerned himself with. He was he was much more interested in, later like Roman history, American history,
That's Caesar book.
and yeah. And I always felt the impression of of New Deal New York on him, and being a child of immigrants. My grandparents were born in Italy. My grandfather worked. He was kicked out of school at age 9 because he hit a teacher because he couldn't learn English, and he had to carry ice and coal up and down the stairs, and his back was hunched, and he died when I was 14. And he had like a hunched back from working as a child, you know, and when my grandmother died when my father was 17 and my grandfather remarried. And my grandfather was born in Italy, but his father actually came over to America. He had kids in Italy, and he brought them over. And he dug the subways. He worked, Giuseppe Parenti dug subways. And like, that was a very, very dangerous job. And a lot of Italians there was one blast where 19 Italians were killed. One of their names, 19 Italians killed. And, so like my father was raised in a New York City with excellent public schools, and he went all the way to Yale by his own effort, but thanks to these really fantastic public schools. In East Harlem, where he was raised, the principal of his principal of his grade school was some like quite famous Italian from Italy educator. And my dad told me he was on a panel with this guy when my father was getting his master's degree at Brown. And he said, "Oh, you were the principal of my school in East Harlem. You grabbed my ear when I was a little kid." The guy was like, "Oh, you must have been doing something bad." He was, because he had lived, he, you know, you could, my grandfather was like, his back was hunched from child labor, you know, and it's like, so like, it wasn't, progress, like reformist politics were not dismissed, and whatever was working for poor people, like really mattered to my father, and it moved him very deeply. And that was more important than anything. And so while his lectures, particularly on foreign policy, in the 80s, at the height of the Cold War, about these revolutions, is like, don't think he dismissed what a lot of people who are probably really into those lectures would see, oh, silly reformist politics. It's like, no, like that kind of New Deal stuff. And he was, You know, Vito Marcantonio represented his neighborhood. Fiorello Guardia was the mayor. You know, these were like, I mean, these were reformist politicians. I mean, Vito Marcantonio was a socialist of some sort, but, you know, Fiorello Guardia was a Republican, actually, but he was a New Deal Republican. But all that stuff, like, was he never dismissed that as like, oh, well, this is just like a sop to prevent revolution. Also, because I think he understood, per those critiques of Stalin, that it's not as easy as it looks to have a revolution, you know? And it's pretty hard to get these things right. And he was always very, very dismissive. And I think I got that from him of this sort of, well, of a kind of anarchist and Trotskyist tendency in particular of being like, well, they don't have the right ideas. So it's like, yeah, but you know what, man? It's like, I'd like to see, you know what, like if it was your guy who was in charge of like Bolivia, this landlocked, totally impoverished country, it's like, you think everything will be totally great? I mean, it's just like this idea that these intellectuals have that if you just get your like ideology correct, then you can face off against the empire, and you can take your underdeveloped little island or your little landlocked, you know, country that's suffering from dictatorship, and it's all going to be perfect. It's like, that's nonsense, right? Real political change is very, very hard, and there are no formulas, and a lot of like, you know, and the left can overlook like meaningful, simple reforms that help people, right? So he was very eclectic in that kind of stuff. I mean, he's like supporting radical things because they exist, and also supporting, you know, stuff that a lot of radicals would see as inadequate sops to radical opinion. You know, that's just Band-Aids or whatever. You know what I mean? Reformist politics.
Yeah, it would have been messy either way. I think it's safe to say that.
What
However,
would have? See,
all of those revolutions, no matter how, like, in order to sustain, they would have, you know, been a little messy. I think though, like, you know,
Also,
some
you know,
some leaders were better than others. Some of socialist leaders were
of
better
course.
than others,
Of
and there were
course, of
competing
course.
visions.
Yes.
Like,
But you know, in Radical Hamilton, the first page, I had these two quotes from Freud, you know, and one of them is about Eros and Thanatos. It was a follower of Freud coined it Thanatos, but he calls it the death drive, you know? And it's like, I mean, there's also an element you just have to recognize that goes beyond property arrangements, that people like are difficult. And, you know, I mean, Vietnam and China fought a war in 1979. And the idea that like that there could be some social arrangement where like the will to dominate and like the you know, the aggressive drive that is so destructive in social life is like, that's going to go away. I don't think so. I mean, I think that we have to contend with a sort of an element in our nature that is always going to make things problematic. And I think if you can accept that, then it can give one a little more humility and realism in terms of like the kinds of politics that actually unfold. And because they're always going to be imperfect. That's what I think.
So I think Machiavelli is one of the greatest political theorists ever to this day, especially the discourses. It's my favorite political text, arguably, because like you know, he thinks, well, people are gonna have certain insatiable desires, and Madison is heavily inspired by that, as you know, right? And his whole thing is to let ambition counteract ambition.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes I think, imagine if what if a socialist society was able to like deal with its own factions by having like a multi-party democracy, but it would only be like socialist parties of different stripes competing, instead of these like quiet purges happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
You would have
Well,
like
all of that
leaders
is
like-
very, very far away because right now we've got, you know, there is no socialism. I mean, the Cold War ended, that all collapsed. And since we've been talking about my father, I mean, that broke his heart. You know, he was never really able to deal with that. Like it was something he like kind of started to detach in a way. because he realized that this was not an opening, that the collapse, the end of actually existing socialism meant the evolution of these imperfect social experiments, the end of the evolution towards something better. It was just it was snuffed out. It was now like, well, stage one was rape and pillage by, foreign capital, International Monetary Fund, shock therapy. And then he didn't really last long enough. I mean, he's alive, but he has dementia. He's 91, but the kind of authoritarian stuff that comes in the wake of that sort of stuff, but he knew that it was just like, that was not good. And there were a lot of people on the left at the time who were like, good. I remember Max Elbaum, who had the decency to take it all back about 20 years later, saying, good, we've finally gotten rid of the succubus of the Soviet Union on the Marxist left of the West. Now we will be free and we'll see real progress for socialism. Max is a nice guy. I knew him.
It gave all the
personally.
labor parties an excuse to abandon the little social democracy that they had. It was like catastrophic, because then you have no competitor to the West. The West has no reason to prove itself. So it's like not a coincidence why all the labor, like all the welfare stuff gets dropped, even by the, the Labor
And
Party.
the U.S. invades Iraq and begins that whole process of destroying one state after another, right? It's like, the Gulf War is the opening act of what ends with the Arab Spring and all of that stuff. I mean, it's just like, utter destruction of that region, led primarily by U.S. foreign policy. And all of that, that's clearly informed by the fact that there was no peer competitor anymore. I mean, who's going to stop the U.S. if it wants to do this? No one. No one can stop them. So, dark times.
Dark times.
But now it's all changed. Now things are just so weird. The world is sudden now the rise of China, and also I think like the evident hollowing out, that victory for the U.S. in the deindustrialization, and Trump is, he's an acknowledgement of the weakness of the society that neoliberalism has left here. I mean, people are so angry, and like the inequality, the suffering, and just the kind of social rot that goes with it. People are furious about it. And now it's also kind of reflecting itself in the fact that, even though the U.S. spends vast amounts of money on its military, it's like deindustrialization is beginning to creep into the military industrial complex. It's like, at one level, it's like, I'm totally opposed to U.S. empire, so I don't really care. But it's kind of interesting. It's like Trump's talking about Greenland, blah, blah, blah. We have 2 icebreakers. Basically, one of them is always in the shop. The Danes have 5. The Russians have 57. It's like, we have atomic weapons. We can end the world, kill everyone, including Donald Trump, in an instant. But like, Biden sent the 7th Fleet to crush the Houthis. It didn't work. It's like the paper tiger is, I think it's like more and more of the world is saying like, well, these guys are like, make these expensive drones that the Ukrainians don't want. Anyway, that's a whole other discussion.
Soviet Union should have been a reformed camp as opposed to dissolved, but reformed in a way much more calculated than the likes of Gorbachev.
Well, if you
kind of changed the whole thing all at once.
Fire up your time machine and go back and tell Gorbachev what to do. Maybe that could be avoided.
Yeah. No, but I mean, it is matter because, like you said, some famous leftists said, it's good. Some still say that it was good that it fell because it, authoritarian regime gone or whatever. But anyway, yeah, people are angry, and Trump is kind of like symptom of that. And I think it doesn't help that like the left reacted how they did during COVID. There's been a huge right-wing turn since COVID, and you cannot blame that all on like propaganda. That's symptom of like the fact that there wasn't another populist side there to capitalize on that. And we're going to talk about that in the back room, which
it's surprise. People are war has come to the bureaucracy, right? War has come to the PMC. And so polls show people are very supportive of what Trump's doing. It's like, surprise, surprise. After the mandates, the lockdowns, the censorship, all the stuff during COVID, it's like, yeah, people are resentful. Is that a surprise? Like, but yeah, let's talk about that in the, whatever you call it, the back room.
Yeah, the Patreon only segment. If you're not a member, of the Backroom. If you're not a member of the One Dime Radio Patreon, you're missing out. You have over 55 exclusive episodes at this point. Instead of spending that on another overpriced Starbucks latte, you can make your coffee at home and just use that for just a month. For a month, you get over all these exclusive episodes, and we're about to have a fascinating conversation on COVID and some of the things you've written on it, probably your most controversial takes, which are, YouTube censors anything that's related to that subject. I'll tell you that. So
That's amazing.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.